Karen Holloway was standing in my driveway, the infamous HOA president. Her blonde hair framed a furious, smug expression, sunglasses perched on her head, clipboard clutched tightly with paper I hadn't signed, hadn't agreed to, hadn't even seen before. Her presence radiated control, intimidation, and an almost tangible hunger for power. Next to her, a police officer stood uncertain, glancing nervously at the forged papers. Karen waved with authority, unsure of what was legal and what was fraud. And there I was, my chest tight, my hands shaking, standing my ground in front of the home I had worked a lifetime to build. Every instinct screamed panic. Every thought raced. How could this happen? Who gave her the audacity to try and steal a home that wasn't hers? And yet, beneath the fear, a spark of determination ignited because this wasn't just a notice. It was a challenge, a test of courage, and a call to expose the lies, the manipulation, and the falsified authority that Karen had wielded for too long. What would I do next? Could one homeowner stand up to the most notorious HOA president in the neighborhood and survive the storm she was about to unleash? The answer would change everything. Basically, the story began in the morning with the kind of stillness that usually feels safe. Bird songs scattered across the trees, dew on the grass glistened, and the faint hum of early traffic painted a picture of suburban normalcy. It was the kind of morning that, if captured a photograph, would seem perfect. Yet perfection, as it often does, proved to be a thin veneer. It was fragile, easily shattered, and that fragility revealed itself in the most ordinary of forms, a piece of paper taped to my front door. The moment I saw it, the world seemed to shift slightly on its axis. Time slowed, the air grew heavier, and a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning dew. The paper was simple, cheap copy paper, yet it carried a weight that words could scarcely contain. Bold black letters screamed across the top. Vacate in 24 hours, property under HOA possessions. The starkness of my message made my heart lurch. My home, which I had worked tirelessly for over a decade to own outright, free from any mortgage, any line, any threat, was suddenly claimed by someone else. The absurdity of it collided with my sense of reality. Every tax bill had been paid, every legal obligation fulfilled, every folder in my safe contained evidence that my ownership was absolute, and yet there it was, a formal looking notice asserting authority over my home, as though the walls themselves belonged to someone else. I took a step closer to the door, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for the paper. Sensation of touching it was surreal, almost unreal. The ink was smudged at the edge, the corner slightly curved, yet the message carried an undeniable threat. I carefully peeled it off, inspecting every word, each clause more absurd than the last. Community Asset Reassignment Protocol, it claimed, as if I had ever heard such a term in my life. Forfeited ownership rights through unpaid community transition assessments, totally $8,437. Every number, every phrase was fabricated, presented with an authority that demanded fear and compliance. At the bottom, stamped in glaring red, were the words authorized by HOA President Karen Holloway. The weight of the paper seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. The calm of the morning, the sense of suburban safety, evaporated entirely. The street, once ordinary and familiar, now seemed alien, filled with hidden eyes behind shifting curtains and the faint glances of passers-by who perhaps sensed the turmoil before I did. A jogger slowed his curiosity, apparent, but he quickly picked up pace, leaving me feeling more isolated than ever. The neighborhood, my once comfortable community, suddenly carried an undertone of manic. As I stood there processing the impossibility of the situation, my mind began to turn. over every interaction I had ever had with Karen Holloway, the HOA president. Over the year, his obsession with rules, regulation, and control had become evident, though subtle enough to dismiss in casual conversation. Her emails, her notices, her consistent scrutiny of seemingly trivial matters. The color of mulch, the placement of garden ornaments, the slightest deviation from neighborhood aesthetic norms had always left a sour taste. At the time, I had brushed it off as typically HOA fusiness. No, in the presence of this blatant overreach, I realized the true nature of our power: methodical, calculated, and unapologetically abusive. Returning inside, I placed the notice on the kitchen table and allowed myself a moment to breathe. My eyes swept across the table where my organized folders sat, each one meticulously labeled with deeds, tax receipt, HOA payment records, and other documentation. The irony was bitter. All the proof that I had lived responsibly, legally, and ethically for years couldn't prevent this act of intimidation, yet the very existence of those documents gave me a spark of hope. If Karen had attempted this, she had overreached, she had assumed authority she did not possess, and that mistake I realized could be exploited. As the day dragged on, paranoia began to creep in. Every sound in the house was amplified: the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, the ticking of the wall clock. Each noise seemed like a warning of a signal. The shadow caused by the afternoon sun felt longer, more sinister, and even the familiar corner of my home began to feel like traps. I found myself repeatedly checking logs, verifying windows, ensuring that no unexpected intruder could take advantage of my distracted state. The neighborhood itself felt complicated, as if the mere proximity of other houses allowed for observation, judgment, and silent reporting. Aim the fear, clarity began to take root. This was not a random act, it was a deliberate. Someone had manufactured a debate, a violation, and a legal authority that did not exist, and they had welded it against me. And in the back of my mind, I knew the key to unraveling this scheme. My cousin, who worked in the country clerk's office, had access to every document, record, and filing necessary to trace the legitimacy of these so-called lines and assessments. If anyone could expose the forgery, it was him. As evening fell, the quiet of the neighborhood returned, but the tension within my home remained palpable. The evocation notice set on the table, a silent accusation and a reminder of the battle that had already begun. I could feel the wheels turning, the planning of the confrontation, the unearthing of evidence that would prove beyond doubt that Karen Holloway had overstepped, had fabricated, and had attempted to intimidate a rightful homeowner. Even as I sat in the dim glow of the kitchen lamp, uncertainty lingered. I knew Karen was methodical. She thrived on fear, on chaos, and on the illusion of the power. I could not predict her next move, nor the extent to which she would attempt to enforce her fraudulent claim. But I also knew that I would not stand idle. I would gather my evidence, consult my cousin, and prepare for the fight that was already inevitable. The morning after discovering the eviction notice began with a sense of unease that clung to every corner of the house. The previous day's shock had not faded, it had deepened into a low hum of anxiety, a feeling that the walls themselves were conspiring to remind me of the looming threat. The paper now carefully stored on the kitchen table seemed heavier, more sentient, as if it were silently judging me and daring me to challenge it. Each glance toward it reinforced the surreal nature of the situation. It was impossible that a piece of paper could hold so much power over a fully owned home. Yet, here it was, a symbol of a calculated attempt to usurp my rights. I began reviewing the contents of the notice, its meticulous detail line by line, searching for any clue, any subtle hint that might betray the truth of its origin. So-called community asset reassignment protocols were entirely fabricated. A quick check of official HOA guidelines, municipal property laws, state statutes revealed no reference to such a term. It was nonsense dressed as legal authority, signed to intimidate and confuse. The more I read, the clearer it became that Karen Holloway had crafted this notice with deliberate precision, knowing that its very presentation triggered panic and fear. She had anticipated the reaction it would provoke, banking on shock as a weapon. Determined not to be caught off guard, I gathered all my documentation, property deeds, mortgage statements confirming I had none, tax receipts, period correspondence with the HOA, and any evidence that could prove my absolute ownership. Each folder I pulled from the safe was a testament to years of diligence, responsibility, and carefully record keeping. It was almost poetic in its irony that these same documents, mundane to anyone else, would become my strongest defense against a person wielding intimidation as a tool. The thought of connecting my cousin, the county clerk, had been at the back of my mind, but the gravity of the situation now demanded action. I called him carefully to speak in measured tones, masking the full scope of my concern until I could be certain of his availability and willingness to assist. He agreed to meet that afternoon, promising to review the documents and cross-check every claim Karen had made against official county records. It was a small spark of hope in a morning otherwise clouded in tension. While waiting for our meeting, I began observing the neighborhood with renewed scrutiny. Each house, each yard, and each neighbor suddenly seemed imbued with subtle layers of information I had ever considered before. Were others silently enduring similar overreach by Karen? Had my neighbors experienced the same intrusive notice, the same fabricated assessments, the same manufactured threats to their property? They thought that this might be part of a large pattern sent a child down my spine. Karen's power was not confined to a single household. It was a network, a system designed to control, intimidate, and extract compliance from anyone who lived under her influence. The meeting with my cousin was a turning point. He spread out the county records, scanning through official filing, lines, documents, and HOA submissions. His brow furrowed as he examined each entry, noting discrepancies, missing signatures, and inconsistencies that were impossible to reconcile with legitimate legal process. Within minutes, it became undeniable. Karen Holloway had created a paper trail of fraud, carefully manipulating record to make it appear that she had authority over properties she didn't own. Every number, every date, every claim had been crafted to intimidate and to obscure the truth. We began compiling the evidence systematically. Each voyage document was photographed, each fake lines analyzed, and every irregularity noted. The process was painstaking, meticulous, and emotionally draining. It was one thing to know in the abstract that someone had attempted to manipulate the system. It was entirely another to confront the tangible proof of it. Line by line, in black and white, my mind was a mixture of anger, disbelief, and determination. I realized that this was not merely a personal battle, it was an exposure of corruption within every structure of our neighborhood governance. As the afternoon sun went, I understood that implication of our finding Karen's action were not isolated incidents of petty enforcement. They were part of our deliberate strategy to leverage fear and misinformation for control. By fabricating lies, asserting false claim, and delivering menacing notice, he had created a climate where compliance was coerced and resistance punished. What had begun as a personal threat to my home now took a broader significance. If left unchecked, this behavior could affect every resident under her jurisdiction, creating a ripple effect of anxiety, financial pressure, and legal vulnerability. Realization left me with a sense of responsibility. It was no longer sufficient of merely defend my own home. The evidence we had gathered could serve as a warning to others, a way to hold and absorb accountable. So I had to proceed with caution. Karen was methodical, vigilant, and capable of swift retaliation. Any misstep could escalate the situation, turning the attempt to protect my home into a larger legal or personal entanglement. Carefully, strategy, patience, and true preparation became essential. By evening, we had organized the evidence into a comprehensive file, clearly documenting every falsified claim, every forged lines, and every fabricated assessment. It was a dossier that could withstand scrutiny, and it provided a blueprint for how to confront Karen and her fraudulent overreach. So I felt a mixture of exhaustion and resolve, understanding that the coming days would require courage, clarity, and unwavering persistence. As night fell, the street outside grew quiet, yet the tension within the house remained palpable. Shadows stretched across the wall, and the eviction notice still sat on the kitchen table. A stark reminder of the challenge that awaited. The next step were clear confrontation, verification, and the slow but deliberate unrevealing of Karen Holloway's fraudulent empire. The battle lines had been drawn, and I was ready to navigate the complexities ahead with strategy, evidence, and determination. The next morning sun rose over the neighborhood, but it brought little comfort. My home once a sanctuary of hard-earned security. Now I felt like a stage upon which a carefully orchestrated power struggle would unfold. The eviction notice remained conspicuously on the kitchen table, a stark emblem of the battle that had begun. I had spent the previous day compiling every piece of evidence, every shred of documentation that disproved Karen Holloway's fierce claims. So now the time had come to take the first concerted step toward confrontation, and the reality of doing so brought its own brand of tension. I began to reviewing the sequence of events in my mind, mentally rehearsing how I would present the evidence, how I would ensure that each claim could be verified beyond dispute. Karen's tactics were subtle but insidious. She had relied not only on the fabricated paperwork but also on the psychological impact of sudden, unexpected threat. By delivering the eviction notice abruptly and with apparently authority, she had manipulated the situation to provoke fear and compliance. To counter this, I would need to maintain clarity, confidence, and meticulous attention to detail. Before making any move, I documented the eviction notice in its entirety, photographing every word and clause. The red stamp of her name, the bold typeface, and the fabricated number all became part of a digital archive. I understood that every step I took need to leave a record, so not just for legal purposes, but to protect myself from my claim that I had acted recklessly or without documentation. My cousin's guide had been invaluable up to me to this point, and I relied on his insight to determine the proper channel through which to expose the fraud without leaving myself vulnerable to retaliation. So by mid-morning, I left my home to approach the county clerk office, a familiar building that now held the key to untangling Karen Holloway's web of deceit. Each step along the sidewalk felt amplified, the suburb's scenery unchanged. So, charged with new meaning, the lawns, the parked cars, and the quiet hum of daily activity seemed suddenly like silent witnesses to a struggle that was as much about justice as it was about property. As I approached the office, the anticipation of verification created a tension that had been absent from my life for years. Ownership had always been a quiet certainty. No, it had become a contested arena. Inside the county clerk office, the steadily lighting and orderly row of filling cabinets offered a stark contrast to the chaos I felt internally. My cousin met me with a calm, measured demeanor, but the seriousness of the situation was evident in the way he gestured toward a private office. As I laid out the documents, the deeds, the Spears prior HOA correspondence, and the eviction notice itself, his eyes scanned each piece with meticulous care. The process was slow, deliberate, and methodical, reflecting the gravity of the task. Each entry in the fraud filing was examined, was referenced against official record, and noted for inconsistencies. It became immediately clear that Karen's effort had been both bold and sloppy. Certain dates were misaligned, signatures did not match registered format, and the severe alleged assessment had no legal standing whatsoever. My cousin explained that these irregularities, once compliant and presented correctly, would not merely challenge the eviction notice. They would expose a pattern of deliberate fraud. It was a revelation that brought a mixture of relief and renewed determination. Karen Holloway had assumed that fear alone would complete compliance. So, what she had underestimated, however, was a combination of evidence, legal knowledge, and personal vigilance. Returning home with us verification in hand, I faced the challenge of planning the confrontation itself. Karen's method was systematic, so relied on intimidation, the manipulation of receiving authority, the assumption that homeowner would not have the means to challenge her claim. To dismantle her carefully constructed narrative, I needed to present the evidence in a way that was unassailable, structured, and impossible to misinterpret. This required not only strategic thinking but also the patience to ensure that each step would be documented for posterity. The confrontation would not be a single act of defiance, it would be a meticulously orchestrated exposure of deliberate wrongdoing. The afternoon passing with carefully preparation, every folder was organized, each piece of sporting material labeled and cross-referenced. I reviewed the timeline of event once more, mentally rehearsing the order in which I would present the evidence and anticipating potentially argument or tactic that Karen might employ. This was not merely about personal vindication, it was about preventing an abuse of authority from continuing unchecked. Each file, each notarized statement, each verified record became a weapon in a battle that, until now, had been fought primarily without anxiety and fear. As evening fell, the first sign of tension in the neighborhood became visible. Once familiar streets seemed more vigilant, as if the residents themselves were attuned to the subtle signal of conflict. Cars passed slowly, eyes were lifted from handheld devices, and the shadows of the fading sun stretched long across lawns. I knew that Karen's presence was likely watching, assessing, and preparing for the next move in what had become an invisible chess game between her ambition and my determination. Before night fully settled, I reviewed the evidence one file time, ensuring that every claim, every forged document, and every irregularity was clearly documented and easily accessible. The eviction notice still sat on the kitchen table, no more a symbol of my challenge to be more overcome that than a source of fear. I understood that the next chapter of this story would involve the confrontation itself, a carefully deliberate presentation of evidence that would challenge Karen's fraudulent claims and set in motion a series of events that could reshape the balance of authority in the neighborhood. Night was quiet, but the tension lingered like a shadow across the walls of my home. I knew that Karen's hallway reaction would not be passive. She had built her reputation on intimidation, control, and the presumption that her authority was absolute. But armed with verification, documentation, and unwavering determination, I was prepared to confront her. The first move in this battle had been carefully executed, but the real test, the confrontation, the exposure, the fight for the truth was about to begin. Next morning, after preparing for confrontation, arrived with a heavy tension that seemed to hang in the air like an oppressive fog. Every glance outside the window, every rustle of leaf in the wind felt magnified, as if the neighborhood itself was anticipating the clash to come. So Karen Holloway, the HOA president, whose audacity had set this entire chain of events into motion, had assumed her position of authority would intimidate and silence. She had no idea that meticulous preparation, careful verification of evidence, and an unshakable resolve would soon challenge her assumption in a way she had never anticipated. I began the day by organizing the verification document into a concise, clear, and coherent presentation. Each forged line, each fabricated assessment, and each fabricated dates was highlighted and cross-referenced with the official county records. The sheer volume of falsified documents, once arranged logically, revealed a deliberate pattern of intimidation. Karen's strategy had relied on the homeowner's fear and the confusion such bureaucratic wage could induce. But in my hand, the documents no longer carried intimidation, they carried proof that exposed every fraudulent claim she had ever made. Before heading to the first point of confrontation, I took a moment to mentally map the sequence of events I would follow. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for the evening, and it was the perfect venue to present the evidence in front of both the board and any witnesses who could corroborate the fact. Every step required carefully execution. The presentation needed to be calm, factual, and unassailable. Any hint of emotion or hesitation could be exploited. This was no longer about reacting to a threat. It was about controlling the narrative and reshaping the perception of authority in the neighborhood. The drive to the HOA office was uneventful, so each moment of quiet heightened sense of anticipation. The streets, familiar and once comforting, now seemed charged with subtle signals. Neighbors observing, watching, and perhaps aware that confrontation was imminent. The office itself, with its big walls, fluorescent lighting, and stacks of paper, appeared innocuous, so it had become the arena in which the first significant challenge to Karen's authority would be mounted. Inside the air with thick with expectation, board member, curious and other cautious, were seated in neat rows. Karen Holloway arrived shortly thereafter, her presence commanding attention. There was a brief, tense silence as eyes shifted between her and myself. She wore her signature smug expression, sunglasses perched atop her head. Clipboard in hand, the atmosphere was charged, a mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and underlying threat. I set the documents on the table, neatly organized, ensuring that each sheet was visible, legible, and easily referenced. The first moment of the confrontation was subtle, so critical. Methodically began presenting the evidence, starting with the forged lines notice, citing discrepancies and indates, signatures and formatting. Each revelation was calm but firm, leaving no room for argument or misinterpretation. Karen's expressions, initially smug, began to shift micro expressions, betraying uncertainty and irritation. She had assumed a position of power that was absolute. The clarity and precision of the evidence in front of her challenged that perception. As I moved through the documentation, the HOA board members leaned forward, clearly engaged. Murmurs of disbelief began to ripple through the room as each fabricated assessment, each authorized action, and each manipulated record was exposed. The intricate web Karen had woven for years to maintain control was unrevealing before their eyes. What had once been a veneer of authority was now shown for what it truly was, a carefully constructed illusion designed to intimidate and dominate. The tension in the room escalated further when county verification records were introduced. These official documents directly contradicted Karen's fabricated claims, leaving no ambiguity. The contrast between her fraudulent notice and the verification county record was stark and undeniable. Every attempt to assert authority was met with incontrovertible evidence that undermined it. Karen's demeanor grew increasingly defensive, her gesture sharper, her attempt at distractor failing to gain traction. So, by mid afternoon, the confrontation had reached a critical juncture. Evidence was irrefutable, and the board was attentive, and the psychologically advantage had shifted decisively. So, Karen Holloway, whose confidence had previously seemed unshakable, was visibly faltering. The power dynamic which she had assumed was fixed in her favor had been overturned through preparation, persistence, and documentation. The subtle strategy of intimidation that had been effective in private saw now crumble under public scrutiny and factual exposure. The culmination of the day's event left a lasting impression. The HOA board members were now aware of the scale and seriousness of the fraudulent actions. The power of evidence clearly presented and systematically verified had shifted the narrative entirely. Karen Holloway's authority, once assumed to be absolute, was now subject to challenge, scrutiny, and accountability. The intimidation, tactic, and that had been central to her control over the neighborhood were revealed for what they were: manipulative, unethical, and legally questionable. As I left the office the evening, the weight of the confrontation lingered but was tempered by a sense of accomplishment. The first battle had been fought, and the evidence had spoken for itself. Karen Holloway, despite her attempts to maintain dominance, so had been publicly exposed, her claim refuted, and her credibility diminished. The story was far from over. There remain the procedural aspect to navigate, so the potential backlash and the lingering tension that her presence representing in the neighborhood. Returning home, I carefully placed the evidence in a secure location, understanding that the fight for full resolution would require vigilance and persistence. So Karen's capacity for retaliation, subtle or overt, could not be underestimated. However, the trajectory for the conflict had shifted in my favor. The narrative, once dominated by fear, was now guided by truth, verification, and strategic exposure. I knew that the following chapter would test not only the limit of Karen's authority, but also the resilience, planning, and foresight necessary to ensure that justice prevailed. The day following the initial confrontation were tense, each one layered with anticipation and the subtle anxiety of impending retaliation. So, Karen Holloway's once confidence in her control over the neighborhood now seemed uncertain. Her usual composure cracked by the exposure of her fraudulent action. The meticulous and evidence cross conference and verified had shifted the balance of power. What had begun an intimidation was now unrevealing in real time, and Karen's empire of fear, carefully constructed over years, was beginning to show sign of collapse. Early in the week, I noticed subtle change in the neighborhood. The mail, once a routine, mundane delivery, now carried undercurrents of curiosity and speculation. So, neighbor previously quiet and seemingly indifferent began to glance more frequently toward the HOA office and the street corner near my home. There was a collective awareness building, fueled by the whispers of Karen's outrage and the undeniable fact that her authority was now under scrutiny. The sense of being observed, which had once instilled fear, had now begun to shift toward cautious sport. Others were silently taking note that intimidation tactics were no longer effective. Inside my home, the documents continued to serve a both shield and strategy. Every fault line, every fabricated assessment, every manipulated record had been catalogued and verified. The knowledge that the HOA president action were now backed into a corner was empowering. So I knew caution remained paramount. So Karen's response would not be a passive. She had built her influence through subtle vision, and while her ability to intimidate had been challenged, so her capacity for retaliation through bureaucracy, subtle manipulation, or misinformation remained a potential threat. By midweek, correspondence from the HOA began to shift in tone, where once the latter had been aggressive, commanding, and laden with a veiled threat, the language appeared cautious, measured, and even hesitant. The sudden change suggests that the Karen had recognized the vulnerability exposed by the evidence. Her usual assertive tone was replaced by a formalistic, sanitized version of communication, so perhaps attempting to maintain appearance while recalibrating strategy. Each letter was carefully reviewed, analyzed for implication, and cross-checked against the verification documents. There was no longer room for ambiguity. Every attempt to assert authority without legal merit could now be countered definitively. Aimed this shift, I began to notice more overt signs of Karen's panic, board meeting once predictable and routine, so no included point question from other members. This scrutiny, fueled by the evidence I had presented, undermined her ability to dominate discussions. The veneer of absolute authority she had relied upon for years was cracking, revealing the fragility of a leadership based more on fear than legitimacy. Karen's attempt to control the narrative to manipulate perception were increasingly met with resistance. Skepticism and factual challenge neighborhood once sublime complicit was now indirectly aligned with accountability. The psychological impact of the exposure was not lost on Karen. Her unusual gestures of control, the clip's tone in email, the sharp insistence on procedural adherence, the calculated timing of notice now appeared forced, deliberate, and strained. Attempt to assert dominance was met with evidence backed. Counteraction eroding the confidence that had once made her an intimidating presence. The contrast between her prior authority and the current reality was stark. She had assumed her position was untouchable, but the combination of the documentation, legal verification, and public scrutiny had dismantled the assumption entirely. Simultaneously, I began to consider the broader implication of the exposure. Karen's action was not isolated. They represented a systematic abuse of HOA authority that, if left unchecked, could have affected countless other homeowners. So each document, each piece of verified evidence was no more than personal protection. So it was a demonstration of accountability and a potential deterrent for future abuse. The exposure, once fully procedure by the board and relevant authorities, and would set a precedent. Intimidation without evidence could no longer dictate outcome in this community. So late one evening, the tension in the house was tempered by the growing understanding that the narrative had shifted irrevocably. Karen's fraudulent tactics had been challenged, her credibility undermined, and her influence over the neighborhood significantly weakened. So on the final day, I felt heavier than any other day. So the neighborhood, though outwardly calm, carried the subtle tension of anticipation. After weeks of intimidation, verification, and confrontation, the moment to secure a lasting resolution had arrived. The evidence I had meticulously compiled, every fraud line, every fabricated notice, every manipulated record, was now ready for the decisive step. It was no longer enough to challenge Karen Holloway's fraudulent authority. So the goal was to ensure that her influence could never again jeopardize a homeowner's rights and that justice would be both visible and unaccessible. So the morning began with a careful review of the evidence, double check each detail. Every document had been authenticated through county record, notarized where necessary, and arranged logically to tell the story of Karen's systematic abuse. It was comprehensive dossier, a record of intimidation and manipulation, meticulously dismantled through the patient. So diligence and strategic action. Each item was not only proof of wrongdoing, but a testament to the importance of preparation, persistence, and accountability in confronting entrenched power. I arrived at the HOA office mid morning, the envelope of the evidence securely in hand. The board members were already present, air thick with anticipation. Karen Holloway entered shortly thereafter, her usual air of smug authority, now tempered with an unmistakable tension. She glanced at the documents laid before me, her expression flickering between irritation and unease. The room was charged with a silent acknowledgement that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. Evidence demanded attention, and there was no room for obfuscation or intimidation. Each document was presented systematically, and the forged lines, misdated assessment, and fabricated authority were displayed alongside verified county record, illustrating a clear and undeniable pattern of fraud. The HOA board member examined each and everything very piece and carefully, their skepticism growing into concern as the depth and audacity of Karen's manipulation became undeniable. It was a precise, measured, and through exposition, leaving no room for misinterpretation. What has once seemed a simple notice of eviction had now been posed as a part of calculated strategy to instill fear and maintain control. As the evidence was reviewed, the room's atmosphere shifted. Karen's Holloway's attempt to assert dominance were met with the weight of documentation. Persuasive tactics rendered ineffective by the clarity and credibility of verified records. Board member previously passive observers so began questioning her authority and the legality of her action. So the power dynamic that had long forever had was now firmly in my favor, reinforced by the indisputable truth present in an organized, logical, and verified format. The realization of the scope of Karen's scheme extended beyond personal vindication. The fraudulent practices she had employed were systemic, and exposing them now served not only to protect my home but to safeguard the neighborhood. The broader implication was clear: intimidation and falsification of records would no longer be tolerated, and every homeowner could now take confidence in the knowledge that had system could be held accountable. It was a triumph not merely of one individual diligence but of transparency, justice, and the power of evidence. By mid-afternoon, Karen Holloway's influence had been effectively neutralized. The forged documents were formally invalidated, the eviction notice rescissioned, and the HOA board had initiated measures to prevent similar abuse in the future. What had begun as a personal threat to my home was now a precedent setting resolution. Returning home, the sense of relief was profound, so tempered with reflection. The eviction notice, once a symbol of intimidation, now felt almost symbolic of the victory achieved through diligence and preparation. Every document, every verification, and every methodical step taken had culmination in the restoration of the rightful ownership and authority. The neighborhood began to settle into a new normal. Conversation among neighbors carried an undertone of vigilance and empowerment. The precedent set by exposing Karen Holloway's fraudulent action had ripple effects, inspiring a culture of accountability and awareness. Residents were now more conscious of their rights, more alert to potential overreach, and more confident in their capacity to challenge intimidation. The power dynamics had shifted not through the confrontation alone, but through preparation, evidence, and unwavering resolve. As night fell on the final day of the ordeal, the house stood quietly, a testament to persistence, vigilance, and justice. The eviction notice, once a harbinger of fear, was now a reminder of the importance of standing firm against abuse. Karen Holloway, her authority diminished and credibility undermined, could no longer exert control through intimidation or fraudulent claims. The home, fully restored to rightful ownership, symbolized the triumph of truth, preparation, and resilience. With the resolution achieved, I could finally reflect on the journey. I had been a test of patience, courage, and meticulous planning. What had begun as a shocking and threatening notice had transformed into an opportunity to assert accountability and expose wrongdoing, ensure that justice prevailed. The lesson learned extend beyond personal victory. They reinforced the enduring power of evidence, vigilance, and the unwavering commitment to protect what is rightful yours. So the battle for my home had ended. Karen Holloway's schemes were fully exposed, her influence curtailed, and the neighborhood restored to a state where fear could no longer dictate compliance. Justice had been achieved not through confrontation alone, but through strategy, verification, and the relentless pursuit of the truth. The home once threatened now stood secure, a symbolic resilience, accountability, and the triumph of rightful authority.